Welcome to the Rocky Mountain Research Station Science You Can Use Spring Webinar Series. My name is Lexi Newkirch, and I will be your facilitator today. I invite everyone to open up your chat box and introduce yourself where you are joining us from today. There is closed captioning available for anyone who needs it. You can access that by clicking on the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen. Today, we're going to be hearing about the aviation use system, analytics to inform decisions, and manage risk. This is the second of 8 webinars in this series, so stay tuned for the upcoming webinars. For your awareness, we will be recording this webinar today and all future webinars. Recordings of the webinars and slides from the presenters will be posted on the Rocky Mountain Research Station webinars page. Jessica Bruin is going to be posting a link to that webpage in the chat for you. If we have anyone from the media calling in to join us today, I would like to let you know that the contact information for media inquiries will also be posted in the chat box. These webinars are eligible for SAF and the Wildlife Society continuing education credits, and we will post a link for the attendance form into the chat after the presentation today, but before the Q&A session. Today's webinar will have a format of a presentation from Crystal Stonesifer, followed by a question and answer session. So if you have any questions that are coming up during the presentation, feel free to begin typing those in the chat box. And I would like to now introduce today's presenter, Crystal Stonesifer. She is an ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and she is currently detailing as the Missoula District Ranger on the Lolo National Forest. So I will let Crystal take it away as I do a quick slide switch here.
Great, thank you, Lexi. Good morning, everyone. So Lexi, you're going to share the presentation. Okay. All right, so I see we have some competition about how cold it is out there. It's cold enough. 0 is cold enough. I'm glad that that's as cold as it is and it's not windy anymore, but let's dive right into it. My name is Crystal Stonesifer, and I'm just super excited to be here today to have the opportunity to talk through this forum of really hopefully connecting to land managers. I'm excited to present my research and the related tools that can, I hope, help land managers more effectively balance complicated risk trade-offs involving safe and effective use of aircraft in fire suppression. Like Lexi said, I live in Missoula. I've worked at the station here for about a decade as an ecologist, and just recently took sort of a career zigzag to be the acting Missoula District Ranger on the Lolo National Forest in a 120-day detail. This is my first National Forest System role, and so it is illuminating and really exciting to be able to have this opportunity to get some invaluable insight into the working reality of folks we are asking to use these tools. And I hope that this really helps increase the relevancy of my research moving forward and ultimately improves the deliverables that we can put in the hands of our agency's land managers as they try to meet land management objectives. In my typical research role, I've historically focused on understanding fire resource use and effectiveness in order to improve efficiencies and how, where, and why we use resources. And through this work, I've sort of gained some expertise in aviation use and related aviation use practices. And the topic of this seminar is the Aviation Use Summary, or AUS, analytics to inform decisions and manage risk. I am listed as the author here, but of course, as everyone's work is these days, and importantly, anything really effective is highly collaborative. This work wouldn't be possible without engagement from folks within the Human Dimensions program and also broadly within risk management assistance. So today I'll just provide you some background and a few examples, and hopefully leave lots of time for questions and discussion at the end. Next slide. So aircraft have been a longstanding and critical fixture for fire response in the United States. We have a modern, just as we see the broader fire suppression system responding to the need for change, sort of systemic, system-wide change, we see those same impacts on aircraft. And we have a modern fleet of aircraft now that bring a different set of capabilities and related missions. So aircraft are flying faster, they have increased capacity or increased maneuverability, and those related missions respond to a modern fire suppression environment, which brings a different set of pressures, increased and more complex WUI suppression challenges, different competing objectives like balancing the need for aggressive initial attack suppression and perhaps a restrained suppression response to capitalize on opportunities for beneficial fire. Moving toward some idea of understanding effectiveness fundamentally requires understanding where aircraft go. So luckily we have technology now that is readily available to track aircraft actions. We can track both flight paths, but we can also track door events. And this is important because we can look at when a door opens and when a door closes, or when a bucket action is engaged, to then turn that information into lines on a map that show where aircraft drop water or retardant. That is a key step in moving toward understanding effectiveness and really moving toward efficient use. Importantly, it's key to understand the relationship between effectiveness and risk, though, because a highly risky action that is also highly effective perhaps is not worth the risk when we're talking about high consequence outcomes. And a key piece of risk-related information for aviation is thinking about risk transfer. And common practice that occurs is when fire behavior increases, perhaps late in the day, 3 o'clock, we pull ground firefighters off the line because we see minimized effectiveness and also for safety concerns. Oftentimes, those are the same periods of the day that we begin to engage aviation assets. And so that unintentional risk transfer from ground to aviation is a frequent occurrence. Similarly, we might have a deliberative transfer of risk where we make a decision from a strategic management scale to say, we understand the risk involved, but we're deliberatively choosing to engage aviation assets over ground for specific goals. An example of that would be in 2020, when there was an interagency system-wide effort to engage aviation assets more heavily and utilize longer sorties and more aggressive initial attack in order to minimize the impacts of COVID on the broader firefighting community. Next slide, please. Any decision to transfer risk from ground to aviation is critically important because of the high consequence outcomes associated with accidents. When we look at annual fatalities, this is for the past 10 years. This doesn't include 2021 data, although they just recently published that report. We see that aviation accidents represent the highest category of fatalities for federal agency and contract firefighters over this time period. So in spite of well-intentioned and effective risk mitigation actions, aviation accidents simply have the high consequence outcomes, and there's inherent risk in every aviation mission. This fact and these accident summary data highlight that it's critical to accurately characterize and weigh trade-offs in a risk-informed decision-making process regarding any transfer of risk from ground to air. Next slide. Of course, while ancillary to human costs associated with aircraft are also an important management consideration because aviation costs represent a significant proportion of total suppression expenditures. This figure shows total suppression costs. It's very Forest Service centric. My apologies to interagency folks on the call. Forest Service suppression costs corrected for inflation by year for the past 10 years. The two lines on the bottom, the one in the middle is all Forest Service aircraft costs, and the bottom line is just Forest Service air tanker costs. We see that suppression costs vary from year to year. We know that is related to the severity of the fire season and fire season demands, but we see sort of this average of 30% roughly over this time period for total aviation costs compared to total suppression expenditures. So given that aviation costs are a significant factor in total suppression expenditures, it's important to manage thoughtfully how those resources are utilized. Next slide. So costs were sort of a reason how this aviation use summary came to be. It started with Soberanes Fire learning review. I'm going to show you several slides that are pretty busy. Don't worry too much about the details. I'll just sort of tell you what is important, relevant to what I'm talking about. This learning review happened after the Soberanes Fire, which was from 2016. It burned for 2 months, largely on the Los Padres National Forest, extensively in the Ventana Wilderness. It started in mid-July, and at the time was the most expensive fire to date in terms of suppression expenditures. It was a $260 million fire. So I was asked to participate in aviation SME capacity and provide an overview on total aviation use for the fire. And I didn't really have a template to do that. It was an unprecedented level of aviation use, and it was very difficult to summarize at the incident scale because this long duration fire was managed by multiple incident management teams. It was serviced by multiple air tanker bases, multiple helicopter bases. And so there wasn't one single data source that could provide a complete picture of use. So I used dispatch records to look at aircraft assignments to get an idea of sort of the aviation assignment footprint for the fire. That's this bar chart shown on the left. And we also obtained and sort of utilized for the first time in this way drop location data from the air tanker fleet and mapped that relative. In this case, we have the final fire perimeter and some progression perimeters sort of showing the fires, started up here on the top left by the star and moved down. Next slide, please. So there was all sorts of information that we shared with the forest through this learning review. A sort of new piece was taking the door events and turning them into drop lines and really using that to highlight sort of extensive use in places that honestly raised eyebrows. And it was challenging for the forest to be in this position where we showed up and Monday morning quarterbacked this challenging, lengthy, exhausting fire. And the takeaway from the forest was it would have been really nice to have this information during the fire, that perhaps if we were able to show up in the middle of the fire in the beginning of August and show them where aircraft were being used, how much they were being used, how that aligned with values or features on the ground, then perhaps the trajectory would have changed. Ultimately, it's not that we want to change the trajectory of a fire that is managed with good decisions. We just want to help inform good decisions. And so if this fire had turned out exactly the same, but along the way, they had intentionally made decisions using, a complete picture of what's happening, then hopefully we inform those decisions in a way that really considers risk. Next slide, please. I just realized I can't see my clock when this is on here, so I should keep an eye on that. So this the Aviation Use Summary became an integral part of risk management assistance, and others have presented and talked extensively about risk management assistance. And many on this call probably are familiar with this. If you're not, go to this website here. I have it also on the final slide, and I think someone will drop it in the chat for you. It's a Forest Service effort that utilizes best available information to address uncertainty and risk within the decision-making process. Also, importantly, it helps measure and enhance performance. And the key piece of this is these thought bubbles around the outside of this screen grab show that it's really about line officer support. And line officer support when they're faced with large or complex fires, challenges with strategic risk management, risk-informed decision-making, and ensuring that tactics align with strategies. Those support pieces help them meet their land and resource management objectives, explore opportunities for beneficial fire, implement the cohesive strategy, and minimize firefighter exposure. And we do that through utilizing experienced line officers to help mentor less experienced line officers through processes involving trade-off analyses or advanced analytics, ultimately utilizing good science delivery so that whatever we produce that supports this product or this process is digestible and accessible to folks who are not experts in these arenas and don't require an expertise in a particular science in order to really utilize the model or analytics to help inform decisions. Next slide. So what is the Aviation Use Summary? It's a very loosely defined decision support framework that's really targeted at land managers to help ensure that the alignment of tactical actions tactical actions are aligned with incident strategies. It's a loosely defined collection of user-friendly analytics, maps, tables, charts, narrative descriptions, geospatial data sets from Google Earth or GIS. It's really customized for user needs depending on the ask. And it's an integral part of risk management assistance because it provides a comprehensive, objective, non-specialized overview of aircraft use, often focused just on air tankers. There's some reasons for that. That it's focused at the incident scale or a broader area of interest, for example, a forest-wide inquiry or a regional inquiry. Next slide. It's built upon a bunch of data sets that we're all familiar with, dispatch records from Ross or IROC, financial flight data records from Aviation Business System, that's a Forest Service data set, flight following system, automated flight following, WFDS fire behavior outputs, values at risk from various sources, boundaries, jurisdictions, DPA boundaries, fuel slope and terrain from land fire or LiDAR data, whatever is available. Retardant avoidance spatial data is an important tool. And then some inputs that you may be less familiar with include the potential control location and suppression difficulty index data sets, and also this additional telemetry unit or ATU drop event data. So I'll show an example of SDI and PCL in a minute. ATU is just a sensor that lives on the aircraft. It's sort of the same sensor that logs the flight following data that we see in AFF. And it just, it produces an output point coincident with an event, in this case, the event being a door open or a bucket action. And so you get a point in space, you get some aircraft parameters, and that information can be used to project a drop line onto a surface. Next page. If you want an AUS for your fire or your forest or some other area, you go to the RMA dashboard and basically click some links and place a request. Rick Stratton is the lead analyst and coordinator, and he sort of vets the request and reaches out to me and ensures that I can meet capacity to deliver it. I'm the only person currently who produces these products for fire managers. We'll talk about the future toward the end of the presentation, but yeah, that's definitely a bottleneck in terms of getting data out to folks. But because it's customized and because we're able to maintain sort of a national scale data set, I can pull data out and sometimes just hand off data. If nothing else, and I'm not able to provide a broader package with supporting maps and tabular summaries, sometimes folks just need the data so they can drop it into Google Earth and help inform a conversation. A key piece of this is getting user feedback. A lot of times I feel like in the heat of the summer, I'm sending products out into the ether. Folks use it and I have no idea if it met their need. I don't know if it was timely, if I met a key deadline that they needed. Having that feedback really will help shape it in a way that will make it more successful for users in the end. Next slide. All right, so finally an example. I'm just going to go through a couple slides of this one product that was delivered. This is from the Pine Gulch Fire in Colorado in 2020. This ask was from Dan Dallas and his Type 1 team. He's been involved in RMA efforts since the very beginning and is a heavy end user of AUS and the sort of broad suite of RMA products. So on this incident, he was showing up to a new fire and utilized this to sort of get a sense of what was the air tanker activity up through the end of day the previous day. And so he could then communicate clearly what the strategy was going forward and how the tactical actions would support that strategy. Next slide. So again, a very busy slide, but this is to just show an overview of what would typically be included, providing a broad area overview of the drops on a map relative to fire perimeter or fire growth, and some kind of planning area is important. And linking that into key features is important. I wanted to show this broader area because this fire is just 18 miles north of Grand Junction Regional Airport, which air tankers fly out of regularly. And so it's also proximate to community and freeways and highly visible. And so there's a lot of social pressure to have an aerial response that is visible to the public in this type of scenario. And so this summary just provides that sort of general overview at that 30,000 foot level. Next slide. On this slide, I just zoomed in to show the bulk of the air tanker activity, which really occurred during the first week of this fire. And we see that this is just shown alongside terrain to illustrate where it was at. And it was really involved in an initial attack effort to contain the fire that kind of spread out into an extended attack effort. And the takeaway from conversations with folks on the ground and folks in the air was that it just really wasn't working very well. The fuel conditions at the time of the fire just weren't really conducive to effective use. Next slide, please. This was another slide that was included in the package, and this shows the drop lines overlaid on a Google Earth surface with potential control location surface. And in this surface, it's a modeled product that illustrates where on the landscape fire is most likely to stop and sort of highlights those key opportunities shown in the blue pool colors. And this would be another tool where you could communicate, one, that it seems like there are minimal clear opportunities for effective line control, at least immediately adjacent to the fire, and two, the use of these air tanker drops perhaps is not coincident with any key features. So they may have been slowing the fire or steering the fire, other objectives at this point beyond just stopping the fire, but this was a tool that the IC was able to use to communicate that he wanted to limit the use of air tankers unless it met a few key objectives, given the effectiveness that they were seeing on the ground. And he was able to hold to that over the course of this long duration fire, which I think is a really testament to the effectiveness of being on the same page about where the incident is at and what the goals are. Next slide. So some more analytics that could be part of a broader package include taking the drop lines and putting them over one of these existing surfaces I mentioned. The potential control locations are shown on the left. I included this because I think it's a really great example that highlights how air tanker drops, which are shown as the black lines, are used coincident with this landscape feature that really represents one of the only opportunities in this landscape where the fire is more likely to stop compared to other areas. On the right, the surface shown is called the Suppression Difficulty Index, and this is a measure of how difficult it is for firefighters, ground firefighters to engage. Using this along with aviation drop locations can help perhaps illustrate drops that may be unsupported or are likely to be unsupported by ground resources. And we know that aviation drops that have minimal ground resource support are just less effective. It's a fundamental best practices used to support ground or to support aviation drops with ground resources. And so an incident manager could use this information to communicate intent to minimize use where drops are unsupported by the ground. Next slide. This is that resource assignment timeline. In Dallas's package from the Pine Gulch fire, I was unable to do a resource assignment timeline because the transition from ROS to IROC in 2020, there was no reporting capability, so we couldn't pull any data out of the system for the whole year. So this is typically the start of the AUS, and it really, I think, is a pretty useful tool because it can highlight some key themes. In this example from the Soberanes Fire, we can clearly see a signal associated with incident management team transition. If you look at the bottom and sort of chunk it up into 14-day assignments, we see a clear signal that seems to be linked to those incident management team behaviors. We also see a shift from partner agency aircraft engagement to exclusively or predominantly Forest Service aircraft, or at least Forest Service contract aircraft engagement. And that's this yellow bars at the beginning. Those would represent CAL FIRE air tankers as the fire moved away from state lands onto exclusively federal lands. We see a shift there. Another important takeaway here is that it really highlights both a buildup and sort of retention of helicopters, because helicopters tend to have a long duration assignment, whereas fixed wing assets often are single day assignments. Then we see, this bulk of helicopters that are assigned to the fire for a really long time. That can result in a pretty significant cumulative exposure and risk to those aviators over time. Next slide, please. Another tool that we can include is this drop condition matrix. And so again, just trying to find ways to illustrate not empirical effectiveness, but relative effectiveness, and how if we're using aircraft in a particular place, how we might shift strategy or shift tactics just a bit in order to capitalize on opportunities that we're not previously utilizing. So on the left, we show burning period category, and then that's the drops are, the drop location data are intersected with slope steepness, vegetation type, and time of day, and populate this matrix to highlight those cells where more frequent activity is occurring. In this example, so the cells that are red are the highest proportions, and we see that most drops occur in the steepest slope category, and late in the day in timber fuel models. This would be an example where these drops perhaps are not making it to the ground, maybe aren't interacting with ground fire in an effective way, and this could be shifted or even halted in order to utilize limited aviation assets more effectively in another place. On the right, this is the same matrix, except for it's sort of recognizing that burning period is a pretty coarse proxy for fire behavior. We're really trying to look at, late in the day, we see fire behavior tend to kick up and flame lengths get longer, fire gets more active. This instead utilizes severe fire danger index. There's a link on the bottom that's from Matt Jolly's work. This is a daily index. So typically this would be more useful at a broader, longer duration summary, but this can highlight where we're using aircraft, perhaps in those most challenging conditions. Again, in terms of relative effectiveness, this would be less effective use or use that sort of falls outside of conditions that we generally accept to be conducive to effective use. Next slide. An important piece of this whole process is accountability and planning. And we really haven't figured out effectively how to implement this to the land manager community. Folks are excited to have the data and the products, but we haven't figured out how to organically incorporate it into the planning cycle in a repeatable and documented way. We have had this forum sort of floating around in various iterations for a couple of years, and we've had some folks use it or try to use it and give us some feedback. But the idea is that we use the aviation data that comes in on a daily basis or some other iteration, and you log what you did. You have a discussion with your air operations branch director, operations section chief, the incident commander, and the line officer, and talk about what's been happening, how has it been working, has it been working, and then what is the plan. Of course, recognizing that there's always contingency room, and none of this decision-making framework removes the freedom for operators to, utilize their experience and expertise to engage in tactics, but it's more about ensuring that those tactics are, again, in alignment with whatever the strategic objectives may be for that incident. Next slide. Okay, I think I'm nearing the end here. So just a quick overview. This has been around since 2017. We've made a ton of these for 70 plus more different fires or broader areas of interest, including multiple incident requests coming from a single incident. So they want an updated version of it a week later or something like that. We've done it on single incidents, complexes, forest regions, for post-fire learning inquiries or retardant misapplication or application reporting. And some of the themes associated with requests include folks are interested in cost apportionment, misapplication tracking, looking at effectiveness of ongoing use, documenting overall location and volume of use, and having a public or even an internal communication tool to just sort of normalize, level the playing field and ensure that everyone is starting from the same place in terms of understanding what is going on. Next slide. So if you want AUS, you go to RMA webpage and you click on the link and it sends an email to Rick. In the future, we hope to this year post updated weekly data by GAC for folks to get and use at their own discretion. And this doesn't come with any other support, no decision support or sort of risk management assistance. It's just the data, but perhaps for folks who are interested in utilizing it and I can't meet the capacity, or maybe they have experience working through trade-off analyses and other RMA sort of tactics, then they may find use in this. This is our hope. Mid-June, maybe we'll be able to provide this information. Next slide. And then the future that we see really is going toward a place of near real-time delivery at a national scale. This is not out of reach. In fact, it is currently available in a sort of in a somewhat similar version in EGP. There are challenges with the completeness and some of the quality of the data currently in EGP that I think sort of minimizes the effectiveness of using that for strategic scale overview. It's a great tool and is moving toward an even better tool for tactical operators who just want to get a quick picture of where drops may occur. And so long as you understand the limitations of what is potentially shown in there and what is potentially missing, then that's a great place to go. The future that we see is automated, looking at the full automation of the analytical package. So just a mock-up on the right, if you could go to a place where all national drops are shown through close of business yesterday, and you were able to select a date range and an area of interest, the aircraft that you wanted to look at, which AUS components you wanted to include, and you pressed a button and it spit it out or sent it to you a half an hour later. That's where we want to go, and really ultimately want to figure out how to complete this feedback loop where objectives, clearly defined objectives, define the use, and that use, the outcome of the use really informs the plan, and the plan drives the objectives. So we have a complete feedback loop where we're learning and improving and continuing to help minimize risk to firefighters and ensure that we are effectively engaged in the right place at the right time with the right tools. Next slide. I think that's it. So I just want to thank everyone for showing up virtually today and listening to me talk for longer than I intended to. Some links there if you want to look at some related papers or visit the RMA dashboard. And I'm happy to take questions. Lexi's going to run the show.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I'm going to stop sharing these slides. And I welcome anyone to post any questions you have in the chat box. We've got some conversation and comments going on, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to post those. And I also invite you to turn on your camera and ask any questions to Crystal here on video. So just give a moment for anyone to post those or ask any questions. In the meantime, we have posted a couple of links in the chat box for you, and we will continue to post a few more of those. And that way you can access some of these links that Crystal shared and some more. All right, a question from Tim. Crystal, is there a long-term plan for automation of this data?
Yes. Yes, it's complicated. So the Forest Service has a ATU data standard that is included now in all large air tanker contract language and most of the helicopter fleet, so type 1, type 2, and I think that the exclusive use type 3 helicopters have this contract requirement. And part of that data standard specifies, without getting too much into the nuts and bolts, but it specifies that the systems collect the data and that they stream it via JSON data standard, which is just like XML. It's just a data language to a spot, to the repository of choice, make it available to the government. We are figuring out, the government is figuring out what that repository is, where it belongs. Like I said, some data is currently available in EGP because some of those data streams are well established. They've been on aircraft for a long time, and there's not any issues with just taking it and parsing a piece off of the AFF feed and sticking it in EGP. I'm not sure that EGP is the right place for these data in the long term. I would really like to see a more comprehensive sort of risk-focused dashboard type of interface where perhaps we also have aviation and ground-based resources in the same place. You know, we track ground resources, or at least we'll be tracking ground resources in more of a widespread way as we move through the future. So having a place where folks can gain situational awareness, have near real-time access to the data, that's the plan, but executing the plan is challenging given just competing interests, competing players, and being able to engage in that IT realm in an effective way as a researcher is pretty challenging.
Thanks. All right, we've got a couple more questions. We've got one from Darren. Is there a library of AUS available at the RMA site?
Is Rick on the, I don't see him on there. I know we have a collection of, they live somewhere. I don't know where they live, but I can follow up and get back to you with that answer. Lexi, you make note of who that is that I just made a promise.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, thank
Darren,
you.
if you could put your email in the chat, or you can send it
Oh,
directly to me in the chat.
Yes, perfect. Okay, I
you
see
can
you
share it
now.
with Crystal.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. All right, we've got another one. Was the intention to have real-time door opening events show up in a platform like EGP?
Yes, I mean, that's the intention. Again, just having this as part of a contractual requirement for the aircraft, we're sort of doing it backwards as an agency. So we have this ask, we have this data, but we're figuring out now how best to use it. The idea of tracking events in time, much like AFF, is extremely valuable for tactical decision makers in the moment, trying to gain situational awareness about what is happening. But what we're seeing is that if we thoughtfully design the system to inform that piece in an effective real-time way, but we also ensure that we are archiving the data, that the data are accessible and quality and complete, so that we can then inform this sort of strategic look, and we can answer simple questions like, hey, what did we do in 2021 as an agency with our aviation assets? Where did we drop? Which regions got retardant? Which fires got retardant? Where did that retardant go? We can track that, and then we can hopefully gotta. Dan, you should just come on and tell us your story.
Yeah, Dan, you're welcome to turn on your
share
camera.
the camera.
Hear me?
A little bit.
I put it in the chat what we actually did, but everything that Crystal just talked about is useful when you use this AUS. You quickly find out, for instance, that we heavily used aircraft when they're least effective in the afternoons in active fire behavior. And then the other thing that was useful with it is we just quickly determined, because there's 56 drops in the black, And ops reported back and said the field conditions are so extreme, we just need to really quit using it unless we need it for something that we're doing. And so we basically couched that and said, well, if there's high value assets immediately at risk, or we build a line or something where we need to support it with retardant, we'll do that. And by then we'd learned that the retardant aircraft weren't available in the afternoons. And so we prepped the line and did it all before noon. So it is really, really useful. And as Crystal said, I mean, I order one every time. So for what it's worth.
Thanks for that, Dan. So Dave asked if I could talk a little bit about the transition from line officer focus to supporting IMTs. And I mean, it seems like in places, for example, with Dan's team, where we have been able to socialize the product, that it's really become integral to their decision-making and communication strategies. And we have some effective engagement with some IMTs, but more often it sort of starts with some of the operations staff, or the air ops folks, and they'll learn about this from a friend or a colleague and then bring it to their team. And really we're seeing a lot of value in that supporting role, like how best to ensure that that the reality of what is happening on the ground is effectively communicated. And that just, I think, helps also build a more effective relationship between the line officer on that incident and the IMT. And it helps maintain some continuity when you have a longer duration incident and you have an IMT transition. The line officer can refer back to that product and say, this is what we were working on, and this is what we had talked about, and here's a map and some data really illustrating that. But that there's a level of perhaps sort of social support for that line officer as they work through various IMT transitions.
Thanks. It looks like Dave also put a link to the RMA SharePoint site, and Lauren also says it can be found under the map viewer tab of the RMA dashboard.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren is the magic behind all of the dashboard stuff. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks. Hi, Colin. Do you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, great presentation. Sorry, I came a little late, but I understand it's being recorded, so that's great. Along the lines of just following on Dan's commentary on how he tends to request AUS, and it's very useful. About how often, or I don't know, do you have any percentages on like how often an incoming IMT requests that? And if we were to seriously increase that, would there be the capacity to fulfill those requests? You probably already covered this.
No.
Yeah.
No, I didn't. That's a really excellent question. I mean, I feel the timing of this presentation, while I'm thrilled to have this venue to present to everyone, is really pretty awkward because I'm in this detail for the next 4 months. And we're making all these, showing you all this cool product and telling you it will solve all your problems. And the reality is it's still just me doing the analytical processing. So it's not rocket science. It's really the nuance in the delivery piece, I think, that makes it really effective. It is completely automatable, if that's even a word. It's something that we can move toward automating, and there is, I think, really strong momentum and direction from the Washington office to move toward executing that. But these things just take time to execute. And in the meantime, I would say the answer to your first question is probably, it's really a small sliver of folks who are requesting this on fires. But what we see from the data and what we know about fires is that most fires, there's only a handful of fires that really are the ones that are highly problematic. Problematic meaning that they're really difficult to control and they end up costing a lot of money. And we see about them, folks, the public sees them on the news and they impact communities and there's significant press. So those same fires often are the same fires that are outlier fires in terms of total air tanker drops. And, we get into sort of a load and return mentality, particularly for fires that don't have a lot of coincident pressures, are proximate to an air tanker base. And until there's some kind of system pause that checks that behavior, we just sort of continue to churn away, doing the same thing, even if it's got limited effectiveness. And so if we're able to hit the pause button so that folks can step back, look at the broader strategic picture, and then re-engage, perhaps exactly the same way, but with a risk-informed decision-making process underpinning that trajectory, then we're in a more successful place. And even if that just happens on a handful of incidents, so long as it's those particularly large and complex incidents, which are the ones that typically request RMA, then I think that we can make a real difference. I would love to get to a place where this is readily available to everyone, whoever wants it, at the push of a button, and that it's not some special thing that relies on one person to produce. But in the meantime, until we have some massive shift in capacity or we figure out how to automate things, then it's going to be pretty limited delivery, especially this season.
Great. Thank you for your question, Colin. Anyone else, feel free to hop in. And we've got some more conversation and comments happening in the chat. All right. So Crystal, unless there's anything else that you want to share right now, I will go ahead and wrap things up with us here.
It looks like there was one more question.
Go ahead. I can read it out to you as well.
Yeah.
How do you balance the idea that your scooper reinforced line was eventually burned through on 25 Mile, but the retardant was dropped on a better ridge feature supported by a road system and crews prepping the ridge later in the incident? With Lake Chelan to the right, it made sense to use scoopers in terms of cost and time.
It's I don't know the answer to that, honestly. I mean, when we provide the AUS products, I get the request. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, I get some additional information about specific, points of concern that the requester might have. On this particular example, it was, just a point in time and they needed an overview of what occurred. I'm not familiar with what happened after that point. And if anyone else on the call is familiar, they can jump in and provide that, or I could follow up with you later one-on-one. It's certainly, if proximal to Lake Chelan, using scoopers seems like a no-brainer. So long as they're using them to meet some kind of objective. That's a great location to utilize that resource. But a scooper is used more in a way like a helicopter, a heavy helicopter, given the short turnaround times and the water delivery. So the mission objectives are different than retardant often.
Thank you. All right. We are getting to the end of our time here. So thank you so much, Crystal, for all of this great information. We will also put your contact information again in the chat box so that anyone can reach out to you, and a few more links just in case folks missed those. And I am going to just share quickly the upcoming Science You Can Use webinars in this series. So next week, we will be hearing from Matt Reeves about a modern approach to quantifying ungulate carrying capacity. So mark your calendars for the same time, same place. We will be here next week to hear from Matt Reeves. And thank you again, Crystal, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Lexi.